For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Or welcome, if it's your first time. I am your host, Jade Black, and today I'm tackling one of the major themes that comes up in my writing. I'm talking politics. Now, you might think because I write political thrillers that, that's just the type of politics I'm talking about, and that's all that comes up in my writing, but that's not true. There are actually a lot of different facets of politics that come up in my writing, and that's why I wanted to do this episode. So you do get the sort of fairly standard economics and politics, that's very snakebite. You also get human rights and the politics involved in that, and that's across a lot of my different books, most notably Mr. Nakagami, but it's across a lot of them. International politics plays a really big part, again, in most of them. And there's also a lot of social politics as well. So, let's start with human rights. And as I said earlier, this features in many of my books, if not outright all of them, to varying degrees. But it's the most major in Mr. Nakagami, Dead Penstemons, and Black Executioner. I mean, Mr. Nakagami is by far the biggest deal, because that's really the whole main quest of the book, is Haru trying to change human rights, liberate people. That's his entire thing. He is a human rights specialist, it's literally his job, and it's all about gay rights and the oppression of gay people and trying to stop all that, trying to lift people out of that. But Haru also deals with war crimes, so human rights of soldiers and civilians, that's something that comes up, and human rights, with women as well, and getting women easier access to work, and he does do some stuff with adoption as well, but that comes up more in Snakebite than it does in Mr. Nakagami. Haru does a lot of work around human rights. Alongside his assistant Ai does a lot of this as well. And Ai continues this with Black Executioner as well. Again, this is a lot of gay rights again, but it takes different tack in Black Executioner because it's not all due process and by the book. It's very much the other way. It's a lot of treason, a lot of danger, because Ai's fed up, basically. He's had enough of trying to do it, the sort of correct, proper way and it not working, so he decides to do the soldier thing. But he also gets involved in human rights for women as well, and a couple of other things also come up on page in Black Executioner as well. I mean, it's a huge deal in Dead Penstemons as well, because this is Koni's book, and it's a gay romance. It's one of the main things. It's a romantic thriller and it's gay. So there's the whole being oppressed in that way, and with Dead Penstemons, it's particularly interesting there because it's so direct with Koni. He's actively breaking those laws in a way that Ai and Haru don't while they're in Hyukai, and it's a very different experience with Koni and what that does to him. But also the contrast with, because it's an interracial relationship and the person he's with doesn't face those same restrictions, and the difference in mindset and attitude and everything between them because of that, I find that absolutely fascinating. But Koni is also Ai's assistant, and Ai is Haru's assistant, so he's involved loosely in those sorts of activities as well. I mean, he does less of that because the mayor at the time that the Penstemons take place is a fucking idiot. So Coney doesn't end up dealing with that quite so much, but he does do a couple of aid missions on page in Penstemons. And the way he handles that is not really the way he's been told to, where it's all about the economics and the this. He prioritises human well-being above that, and rightly so. But that's his whole standpoint, is again, it's all influenced by his experience of oppression, not wanting people to suffer how he did and how he continues to later on. So we move into sort of mainstream politics and the sort of economics and politics and the sort of classic, what people think of when they hear the word politics. This is, major in Snakebite. I mean, Snakebite is a much more classic political thriller in that way. Hanzo is a politician. He is the Minister for Defence at one point. He's the mayor at other points. He's an assistant at other points. He is very strictly in the politics side of politics. And he does a lot of work economically because he's very good at it. Hanzo is crazy good at maths, and he enjoys it as well because he's weird as shit, but he's very much involved in all of that. He manages a whole load of that, does some very, very, very dodgy economic deals, and that's all on page, and there's backstabbing, and it's a lot of fun. I really love that in Snakebite. It is a huge, huge part of the story, but there is also threads on children's rights with Snakebite, because Hanzo loves kids, which is not necessarily something you'd think of with him, but he does quite a lot of string pulling around stuff like that and gets Haru to do some stuff around children's rights, and that improves massively with Hanzo around. So that human rights thread is still there. Economics and that sort of classic politics stuff comes up more than I assumed it would in Beneath the Moon. Beneath the Moon is Helga's project, for what it's worth, and this is a revenge thriller, and it's all about war and the build-up to war and all of those things, and I didn't really think that politics would really come into it that much, not like mainstream politics. Even though Helga is on the leading council of South Fjordavik, I didn't really think that would be her role particularly, and it's not, for what it's worth. That is someone else's job for the most part. But the things that South Fjordavik and Helga the things that they have to do are greatly impacted by politics and economics, and they end up doing things that they shouldn't really have to do, and the way that everything she does and everything she plans is impacted is because of that, because South Fjordavik, the whole thing wouldn't happen if South Fjordavik were in a better economic position in the first place. It's the underlying drive for everything she does is how bad South Fjordavik have it. Economically, politically, all of it. And, people are dying because of it. It's not sustainable. So, in her mind, they're doing what they have to do, and it's actually quite hard to argue against her in a lot of ways. And economic, as seen on stage, is one where I knew sort of classic politics would get involved, but I don't think I realised exactly how big of a deal it would be until I wrote Count the Stars. And as seen on stage is Isamu's project. This will be the 8th determined one. And this is an interesting one because his whole thing, it's a musical thriller, but it's also a peacekeeper thriller. His whole thing is keeping the peace, and keeping Hyukai going, keeping Hyukai stable. And of course with politics, the more unstable they are, the more dissatisfied people are. The more he has to work at that, the more he has to do. And it actually is going to be, again, a massive part of the story. You might be able to argue and that it is as big an issue in a scene on stage as it is in Snakebite. Or at least close. It's a massive, massive part of that story. You sort of get a taste of it in Count the Stars, though not quite in the same way, but politics hangs heavy over Count the Stars, and as politics hangs heavy over As Seen on Stage. And for what it's worth, Count the Stars is out now. You can read that. I will link to it in the description for those that are interested. International politics is another one. And again, this is a big deal in Snakebite. Hanzo doesn't do that much travelling in Snakebite in terms of international politics, but he ends up thrown in the deep end of it a couple of times. He ends up in Cana, though that's very brief and that doesn't, not much. He ends up in Cana at one point, though that's very brief. He has a couple of altercations in Malasar that are, they're very Hanzo. Let's put it that way. It's very tense. It's very much a game of chess, proverbially. I think the biggest international politics thing, though, with Snakebite is the era and Hanzo's relationship with King Rome. Because oh boy, these men do not get on at all. I mean, when Hanzo first becomes mayor, he is snubbed big time by King Rome. And Hanzo, being an angry person and, you know, loves a bit of the drama and a bit of the showmanship, he does what Hanzo does and he stokes some fuel onto that. And it just gets worse and worse and worse through the years, and to an extent it is, you know, comic relief. It's very funny, but it's also, Hanzo, you can't say that, or, you know, there are going to be serious consequences, but he says it anyway. And it all comes to a head when the two men actually do meet on page, and everyone around them is holding their breath, and rightly so, honestly. But that whole spat between the two actually distances Yukai and the Era as nations, perhaps unsurprisingly. But that's a very deliberate move by Hanzo. There's a lot of skeletons in the Era and in the proverbial closets, and he doesn't want to be anywhere near that. He doesn't want Yukai anywhere near that, because it is really quite dangerous, and Yukai are better off for it, though no one's going to tell Hanzo that, because that's probably even more dangerous. International politics was not something I was expecting to loom so heavy overshadow on the snow as it does, but oh boy it does. It comes up almost immediately on page, which is something I really wasn't expecting, with how bitter Shinichi is about Yukai being at war to begin with, and how bitter he is that that's happened. And he talks about it with his mission partner in the sort of pre-war, pre-mission thing. And that's like the start of chapter 1. And they get talking about that because, you know, the war is starting in, you know, a matter of days' time. And they're sort of saying to each other, how did we end up here? And one of them says, well, that's because no one wants to fight a proxy war for us, because we're sort of out of the way of everybody. So it comes up straight away, and that whole idea of, well, just nobody wants to fight a proxy war for Yukai, it doesn't go away, because things would be so different if they just had an ounce of help. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows. And it's hard for them to shake that, you know, the longer it goes on, the worse it gets, because they're going through years and years of hardship, of torment, of truly horrible things going on. And it doesn't have to be that way. It actively does not have to be that way, but proxy wars are expensive, so nobody's doing it. And it's logistically, you know, a bit of a pain and maybe not that useful to them at the end of the day, so it just doesn't happen. And people suffer and die because of it. UK and South Yordavik are never the same again. Just because of that. Because of international politics. Talking of South Yordavik never being the same again because of international politics. Again, it looms heavy over Beneath the Moon, that exact same argument that actually nobody's going to fight a proxy war for South Yordavik either, because nobody wants that land. Nobody really wanted that land as it was in the first place. Not even South Yordavik wanted it like that. I've talked about this on the podcast a few times at this point. At the founding of South Yordavik, they got fucked over by international politics. That actually, their whole existence as South Yordavik has been shaped by international politics and international skullduggery. And it's because of that that so much has gone wrong for them, and they've really had their hand forced one way or another into doing something that nobody wants to do. Nobody wants to, you know, slaughter a load of people out of nowhere, put their own people at risk. Nobody really wants to do that. But what choice? It's either that, or they literally go beyond the ocean to try and find new land to settle on. That's their two options, and you know, the knowledge of how to cross an ocean was lost in the downfall. I mean, there are little fishing boats and ferries to and from Cana and Salachi, which is the island of Amarici. There are aquacraft that do that ferrying, but they're by no means proper ocean-going vessels. It's not that much sea to cross. You know, it's a few miles. It's not much. It's not like doing the Atlantic or anything. There's no craft even remotely capable of that. And were South Yordavik to even try and build that, I mean, how do you even begin trying to adapt something like, you know, a little ferry ship into an ocean goer with nothing to really go off? What to expand, what not to expand, and even just the resources, the wood, the craftsmen needed for that. By the time the First War is over, they literally just don't have a way to do that. It's not physically possible. And even should they do this speculative exploration, they don't know what's out there. They don't know, A, if there's any other land. I mean, they strongly suspect there is, but there's no real way to confirm that. Any land that they'd be welcome in, that they wouldn't just land at and immediately get slaughtered. Any land that's any better than what they've got. Or any real guarantee that any exploration team would be able to find their way back. Because nobody knows how to navigate at sea, either. So, they have been well and truly screwed by international politics, and are continuing to be, no matter which way you cut it. And that's the full driving force behind Beneath the Moon, and arguably Shadow on the Snow, really. Social politics is an interesting one, and not something I necessarily expected to come up as much as it does in the Determined Ones. I certainly didn't expect it to come up, again, in Shadow on the Snow. Shadow on the Snow is a much more political book than I thought it would be in so many facets. I mean, it's a military thriller, it's war, of course it's going to be political, but with how many facets and how many different avenues, it's way more exacerbated than I thought it would be. And the one thing in Shadow on the Snow that really comes up, well, there are two big ones. The first is this big us and them attitude, because Shinichi is an elite soldier in the Hyuki's military. And while, you know, military ranks and hierarchy and all of that, most people respect that, and for the most part it's a non-issue. But there is one point where it actually becomes a massive problem, and Hyukai suffers a lot of damage because of it, and it's something I did expect to come up, but not quite so violently as it did. I can't say any more about that without spoilers, so we're going to move on to the other facet, and this is about Shinichi's backstory. I've probably mentioned on the podcast before, though it will be a while ago at this point, that Shinichi was raised in an orphanage. He has no parents, at least that he knows of, not that anybody knows of. And being an orphan in Hyukai is a very strange thing. You know, he's one of those people that, I mean, like in our world, people don't like to think about orphanages and the kids that don't get adopted and what happens to them when they can no longer stay in an orphanage. People don't like to think about that. People like to pretend that that doesn't happen, that that doesn't exist. So this is Shinichi's life experience, you know, in his early life, that a lot of people, the majority of people really, like to pretend that he just kind of doesn't exist. And then, once he's sort of the end of the war, one way or another, is in sight, just because it's proverbially and literally a war of attrition, and it can only go on for so long. And Shinichi, but despite the odds, is still standing at that point. And he has a conversation with two people. It's his best friend and his mentor. And they notice Shinichi is sort of shifty, he's uncomfortable, and they're like, okay, well, what's up? And he talks about this. He talks about, you know, for the longest time, nobody wanted to know I existed, people pretended I didn't. And now, you know, if the war ends tomorrow, which is a possibility, you know, unlikely but possible, you know, I'm an elite soldier, I've done all these things, and everyone's gonna, you know, welcome me as a hero all of a sudden. And, you know, the flip switch there is just sort of bizarre, and he's sort of saying that, you know, I'm going to be welcomed as a hero and I'm supposed to be grateful for that, but these are all the same people who tried to pretend I didn't exist when I was having a hard time. But I'm supposed to, you know, be happy that all of a sudden I exist to them because I did this thing and I didn't really even do it for them, I did it for the land. And it's very uncomfortable to think about. And he's very open about it, and his best friend, for certain, doesn't really know what to say and what to make of that. Understandably so as well. Social politics was always going to be a big part of Dead Pensaments, because it's a romance between a diplomat and a king. And it's also, you know, an ordinary man and a king. So there's a lot of social politics going on there. I think what's particularly interesting about the social politics between the two main characters, in Coney and Curtis the king, is that Curtis as king makes a big point and a very conscious effort to treat Coney as his equal. That actually it doesn't matter to him that this is king and commoner. You know, you're my equal and I will treat you that way. You know, fuck all the social politics, fuck all of that, I don't care. We're going to put all that aside and we're going to have this how it should be. And it's almost the contrast between that and between how everybody else, and I mean everybody else on the continent, would see it, does see it. It's so stark, it really drives home what Curtis is doing. But it's not just that in Dead Pentiment either. Coney is low middling rank in politics, diplomat is not massively high. And he's got I as his immediate boss, who is also a war hero, and he's got Haru above I, although Haru doesn't appear very much. He does make an appearance on page, but it's a small one, and you've also got Hanzo's there at different points because of course he is, and he's very senior, and you've got the mayor who's very senior, and Coney interacts with all of these people and foreign dignitaries as well. So there's a lot of social politics there, and how Coney behaves, and how he very quietly sticks his fingers up at that as well, because at one point, he's meeting with someone very important, so he has to dress up a bit more, and he's sort of expected to wear a tie, which Coney doesn't usually have to do. But Coney opts to wear a bow tie for the sake of it's ever so slightly less formal, and it's a very, very slight fuck you. And it's a very deliberate move by him, because he hates social politics and what it's meant for his entire life. And I love Coney for that. Amber Shackles, likewise, again has a massive social politics thing, because this is the time at which Curtis is a protagonist. He's like 14. And 14 is a very weird age, because it is technically the Malasama age of Major. At 14, Curtis is technically an adult, but nobody really takes that seriously until you're 16 in Malasama. So he's in this very weird sort of semi-in-between spot, but on top of that, he's also the Prince of Malasau, which is a very weird spot to be in, full stop, as a child, I would think. Child, teen. But also, it's a particularly difficult spot when your dad, who is King of Malasau, absolutely fucking hates your existence. So, there's a whole load of shit going on there, and social politics between him and, his parents as monarchs, and so much politicking there. And politics with Curtis and the castle staff, and Curtis and, his teachers, and the Malasau military, and the general public. I mean, it's absolutely full of social politics. And like Coney, Curtis is not too fond of them. I think that's something they bond over. As seen on stage, again has a lot of social politics in it, but in a different sense. Because, again, being a peacekeeper thriller, a lot of this is about people's interactions with each other, how they treat each other, and Isamu's job, really, is to influence all of that, keep it calm, keep it civil, keep it, preferably, happy and nice, without anybody knowing that he's doing it. So he has to navigate around, skirt around, and dance around social politics all the time, do everything according to the book, but also not. It's a bit of a mare of a job, really, that he's sort of entrusted to do by no one in particular, but someone he has to, and nobody else is doing it, so he ends up doing it. It's going to be very interesting to write that. I really can't wait. And, making this podcast board really got me thinking about quite why politics in all its many forms is such a major theme, and quite why it comes up as much as it does. And I think it's partly within the name of the determined ones. They're determined, they're very ambitious people, they've got big goals, for themselves, for their nations, for the continent. I mean, even with someone like Coney, where it's, in a sense, much more human, much smaller, he's still trying to do something really quite major. And ambition and people trying to punch above their weight is always going to be a very political thing. And there's always going to be politics involved in that, especially social politics. And when you're in politics and trying to make big differences to a lot of people, the more political that it's going to get exponentially, really. The harder you try, the more you throw yourself into it. I think it also stems from writing marginalised characters in various ways. So, I mean, it's actually pretty rarely a racial thing with my characters, at least in undetermined ones. But you've got Helga, who's, you know, a woman in South Yordavik, which is almost inherently a crime, frankly. But she's a woman in a very high up position in South Yordavik, and there are a lot of people who don't take very kindly to that, so there's that facet of it. There's also, as I touched on earlier, with sort of orphaned characters, and there are a few of those, so there's that sort of marginalising that way, sort of slightly under the carpet sort of a way. And with, you know, young Curtis as well, and, you know, really there's an amount of ageism there with him. But above all, really, with my writing, is that a lot of my characters fall into, you know, discriminated and marginalised because of their sexuality. I did when Pride Month came around, I did a big sort of drawing around that whole idea of, you know, pride flags and, you know, pride with the determined ones. And when I was doing that and sort of concepting it, I realised that actually all of them fall into that. You know, I've got a lot of gay characters in Haru's gay, Curtis is, Coney is, I'm 99% sure Helga is. Can't strictly confirm that because there is no romance in Beneath the Moon, but, like, she is, and Isamu is as well. And you've got Ai, and you've got Hanzo, and you've got Shinichi, and they're all bi. So they all fall into that. And with, you know, across much of the continent, that being illegal, that inherently becomes very political. And these are a lot of very marginalised and, in some cases, extremely oppressed people for all kinds of different reasons. A lot of them are involved in politics or human rights or both in some way. So that sense of politics and everything is that much higher because of that. It is. You know, the more marginalised people are, the more political their existence becomes. And their lives and their choices become more political just inherently because of that. We see that in our world as much as anybody else's. And a lot of this, all of this combined, all of this nonsense people have to deal with, does contribute a lot to, you know, their fire and their determination to keep going, and the profound anger that they all have, you know, buried or not. They all have this profound anger that drives them, and I've got a whole episode about that. And, you know, during the time of the determined ones, that anger is productive and it's contained. Later on in the timeline, I don't know that I can say the same thing. And I'm just going to leave that episode there. Now, talking about later on, you know, I love these terrible segues to this segment. If you are published or later on you've got a book well on the way, please do get in touch. I would love to be a part of your journey. My email is on the screen. There is a list of things I want to know in the description in your initial contact. Please read that. Please include that information. A few things to note. Indie and self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from. Other things to know, there's no genre restriction, no age category restriction, doesn't have to be a novel, novellas, short stories, poetry, whatever, it's all welcome. It doesn't have to be a new release by any means, it also doesn't have to be out yet. Whatever you've got, bring it in, let's see what we can do. And if you're looking for me elsewhere in places where I don't make terrible segues, if you're here, you're probably looking for the home of the podcast, where you'll get advance notice of what the episode for the week is, soundbite teaser reels, and some indie book content. That is Instagram. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. And if you are interested in more of my world building and some art, exclusive art related to that, and ideas of what these places I write about sort of look like, Pinterest is the place for that. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. And if you're looking for live-ish updates about my writing and to maybe join the monthly Thrills prompt community, you'll be looking for my Twitter. And I am JadeBlack21 on there. And until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like. It helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me. Copyright JadeBlack 2024.